We'll ask everyone to please be seated at this time. We're about to begin the service for Mrs. Ruth Weiss. We want to welcome everyone here at the chapel as well as people that are viewing online. For those of you here in the chapel, just make sure that your cell phone is in the silent mode or turned off completely. That would be appreciated. Officiating this afternoon is Rabbi Jeffrey Weil from Ezra Habanim, the Niles Township Jewish congregation in Skokie.
So Dan and Paul are wearing the Korea ribbons. Korea means tearing. And can you hear okay? Can you hear? I'll try to talk a little loud. Korea means tearing, and Jewish tradition, when someone dies, or even when something really calamitous, our biblical forebears do an act of Korea, which would symbolize their how their lives are torn and how their hearts feel torn, sort of exposing the torn hearts. And so I'll ask the two sons of Ruth to rise in just a moment, and you'll repeat after me the blessing for Kriya, which begins with a Baruch. And of course, since you're Niles Township Jewish Congregation alumni, you'll remember how these blessings go. Start with Baruch Atah Adonai, and then simply Dayan HaEmet, which means the judge of truth. I'll lead you in that, so please rise and we'll do that blessing. It is interesting, this blessing that they just recited that acknowledges God as the Dayan HaEmet, the judge of truth. And we do that even in really sad times, including terribly sad times. And we are, as hard as it is to express it during those times, we acknowledge God, or try to acknowledge God as the true judge, even when our hearts are really broken. That's our tradition, guides us in that direction. Adonai ma adam v'teda ehu ben enosh v'techashvehu. Eternal God, what are we that you have regard for us, and what are we that you would even be mindful of us? We're all of us just a breath. Our days are a passing shadow. We come and go like grass, which in the morning it shoots up and is renewed, and in the evening it fades and withers. But God, you cause all of us to return unto dust, saying, Shuvu b'nei Adam, return, O mortal ones. Would that we were wise, would that we understood whither we go from here. For when we die, we carry nothing with us, not our glory, not our riches. But God, you say, Shmor tam urei yashar, mark the wholehearted, behold the upright, for those are the ones who shall find shalom, who shall find peace in their lives and at the end as well. And so we gather today to remember one who was wholehearted and upright, Tam v'yashar, and loving and caring and fun, Ruth Weiss. Ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach be'etzat risha'im, u'v'derech chata'im lo amad, u'v'moshav leitzim lo yashav. Ki im b'torat Adonai chavtso, u'v'torato yehegeh yomam v'layla. Adonai mi yagor ba'ohalecha. Eternal God, who may abide in your house? Who may dwell on your holy mountain? It is those who are upright, those who do justly, those who would not wrong others or shame them. It is those who give their word and do not retract. It is those who would never take advantage of the vulnerable. Those who live in such a way shall never be shaken. I'll read now the 23rd Psalm. Our tradition has something appropriate for all the moments of our lives, the happy times and sad times as well. 23rd Psalm is in our handouts. I'll read it first in Hebrew, and then we can read it together in English. Do you have the handouts? Okay, Susan has them. We're bringing them right now, 1 second. So I will begin in Hebrew. Adonai ro'i lo exar. Bino desher yarbitzeni, al meit minuchot ninahaleni nafshi yeshavev. Yancheni v'magle tzedek l'man shemo. Gam ki elech b'geit salmavet lo irara ki ata imadi. Shiftecha mishantecha hema inachamuni. Ta'aroch l'fanai shulchan neget zorai. Dishanta v'shem roshi kosi ravaya. Ach tov v'chesed yudefuni kol yemei chaya. V'shavti b'veit Adonai le'orech yamim. 23rd Psalm together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The third chapter of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, also presents this idea that things in this life, like there's a justice to it, that things are unfolding the way they should. And again, this is sometimes a very difficult theology to accept, given what happens in our lives sometimes, and given the state of the world sometimes. But it's consoling nonetheless. For everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot that which is planted, a time to tear down, a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to grieve, a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, a time when we must refrain from our embraces, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep, a time to discard, a time to tear, a time to sow, a time for silence and a time to speak. And so we speak. We take this opportunity to speak about the life of Ruth Weiss. Ruth, that is the biblical Ruth, Ruth of the book of Ruth in the Bible, had one concern. It was her family. She, for instance, millennia ago, insisted on remaining with Naomi, her mother-in-law. They were both widows at this point. Even though leaving Naomi would have been better for Ruth, Ruth insisted on staying with her. She was also deeply devoted to her husband, despite differences of age and culture. And Ruth also focused on her family and her family's happiness and its success. So much so that from Ruth, the Israelite monarchy would eventually arise. She was the great grandmother of King David, great-great-grandmother of King Solomon, and so on. But Ruth Weiss, throughout her life, also carried that same primary concern, family. Although, of course, the details of the Ruth's lives differed. Ruth of the Bible is from Moab. Your Ruth was from Humboldt Park. Ruth of the Bible was handy with farm tools. Your Ruth, handy with the tennis rackets, for instance. Ruth of the Bible was great-grandmother to kings. Your Ruth, well, she's got these 4 beautiful great-grandchildren, so who knows? Kings and queens. Could be. Either way, both of these Ruths were a dedicated, positive, central presence in the lives of their families, and both really matriarchs. Ruth Saber was daughter to Morris and Vera. sister to Ray. Morris and Vera were Yiddish speakers. He painted houses and more. The family was not wealthy, but her childhood was good. And she and her brother Ray remained very close throughout the decades. Ruth was athletic as a kid, a skill and an interest that she sustained throughout her life. As a young woman, after graduating from von Steuben, she had gone out with a young man. That did not work out. It happens. But one of the young man's buddies took a liking to Ruth, and the feeling was mutual. And so Ruth and Leon married. And they raised their sons, Danny and Paul, in really like a family village. The Weisses shared a two-flat in Skokie, I think on Knox near Oakton, with the Pinsky family, with Helen and Alex, Janet, Gail, Milton, and Marty. It was communal living. On any given evening, Danny and Paul might have dinner either at their own table, in the kitchen, across from the stove, I think you said. Or they might find themselves at their cousins' or aunts and uncles' table. And they might be sleeping in one apartment or the other. That's how it was. But Ruth was a consummate mom. She was caring of her sons, loving and supportive of them. She'd help out with homework, and she was eager to get her boys outside, often playing and teaching them tennis, and I'm sure more. After a few years, the family moved north, still in Skokie, to Keystone. Ruth was very devoted to her husband, Leon, and he to her. They did not fight. 52 years of marriage, they did not fight. Fiercely loyal to each other throughout the decades. And that is good, because they spent a lot of time, just the two of them, traveling, often thanks to Leon's work. They traveled extensively, and when the boys were young, Enid would stay with them. The Weiss family was very fortunate to have such a wonderful relationship with Enid, and she and Ruth, Enid and Ruth, were lifelong friends. Ruth had many friends, among them the Alec family, the Alex, Elsie and Hank, and Susie is here. Ruth was fun to be around. She loved theater and sports, bridge, gambling, but Paul will be talking about that part of it. But perhaps gambling, I was thinking gambling for Ruth might have just been like another kind of sport, another way to have a good time, perhaps to compete, to win in a way. Tennis, of course, was her primary actual sport. It should be noted that the Weiss family was very involved at the congregation that I serve now. Back then it was called Niles Township Jewish Congregation, now Ezra Habanim, the Niles Township Jewish Congregation. And Danny was the first bar mitzvah of Rabbi Neil Brief, who passed away last year. That's a good distinction. Tennis, as I mentioned, was Ruth's primary sport, and Danny, who obviously took that up with really very passionately and seriously, sometimes when en route to a match, would call his mom for wise tennis counsel. She would say something like, "Rush the nets." And Dan may not have always or even often heeded his mother's advice, but is still a good son who calls his mom to ask for advice. Both Danny and Paul established themselves on their own lives, and Ruth and Leon celebrated as the family grew. As Sharon and Sheila entered the family, Ruth is also a loving aunt to many, and we'll hear from Laura Beth soon. Ruth was fun and friendly. She could start up a conversation with like anybody, online somewhere, at a restaurant, strangers. She was just like that vivacious spirit, which really brings light and energy to a room. And no one benefited more from this fun, energetic quality of hers than her grandchildren. Brian and Aaron, Josh, Max, Hannah, and Jenna. She loved to be involved and engaged in her grandkids and in their lives, and they loved her, as you said. Grandchildren loved their grandma to pieces. In Lincolnshire, she and Leon lived just half a mile from Paul, Sheila, and family. And they would meet, they would go to the park, to the pool. Fortunately, there's a tennis court right there as well. And living so close fostered many wonderful, happy memories. Perhaps evoking memories from back in the day, from Knox Street, from South Haven, and so forth. Happy times indeed. But yes, life does bring its sadnesses too, of course, and you have experienced a terrible losses of Aaron and Hannah. They should be acknowledged, that should be acknowledged, and their lives acknowledged, and the loss acknowledged now, their memories for blessings, Zichronam Livracha. And this is one of the irreconcilable ironies of our lives. There is sadness and there is joy. There are losses and there are gains. Gains like weddings, a new generation. Ruth welcomed into the family, indeed, grandchildren-in-law, Jennifer, Cheryl, and Cacao, and great-grandchildren, Sam, Ella, Rachel, and Jacob. In recent years, of course, as she closed in on 90, surpassed 90, things change. Every life changes. Things get more limited. And that happened with Ruth Weiss too. But her fun and her vivacious and even athletic self was still evident. She had to relinquish tennis, which is difficult, must have been very difficult to do. But even in her late 80s, she was driving golf balls, sort of vibrant and irrepressible. Our sages of old, taught something really ironic. They said, maybe not ironic, but maybe just kind of very obvious. Let there be mourning at the time of mourning. Let there be rejoicing at the time of rejoicing. It's interesting that they put that together, those two ideas together, because it makes sense in a way. This is a time of mourning. You mourn, for you have lost a great, positive, fun, supportive presence in your lives. One who placed you, her loved ones, at the very top and at the very center of her life. And yet it is really for that very reason, in that mourning, that you rejoice too. Maybe that's why they put it together, because you rejoice at this time of mourning too. Rejoice for simply having known her and been influenced by her. Rejoice for the way that she lived. And rejoice for the way that she loved. For it was an inspiration. And her life offers you what we call a dugma, an example to emulate throughout the years of your lives. May Ruth Weiss's vivacious, loving spirit be for you a cherished legacy. May you share the love that she shared with you. May you share it with each other. And may her memory be for blessing. Amen. It's my honor first to call forward her son, Paul.
Just want to thank everyone for coming. It was, I know it's a difficult time. I know it's a difficult time. I want to thank everyone for being here, especially Ann Helm. And, I'm going to be probably repeating a little bit what the rabbi said, and but we'll get through it. Yes? Okay. A little background about my mom. As was said before, my mom grew up during the Depression and World War II in Humboldt Park. She lived with her parents, Vera, also known as Grandma Vu, and Morris, her dad Morris, her brother Ray, and her grandma. They mostly spoke Yiddish at home when speaking with her grandma when they were around. She adored her brother and dad and had a very, very happy childhood. My dad met my mom in the early 50s and immediately fell in love. They got married in 1955 and were happily married for 52 years until my dad passed away in 2007. As before, growing up, my parents moved in with my Uncle Alex and Aunt Helen, who also had been married in 1955. They raised 7 kids, born 6 years apart, under the same roof in a 2-flat. To say that we had a happy childhood would be a gross understatement. It was just a wonderful childhood. My parents then moved to a different part of Skokie in 1967 and lived there until 1998. We had many happy times in those 31 years, which of course included the famous annual Thanksgiving Day party and the cooking of all the pies and the celebration of 6 grandchildren being born during this time. In 1998, my parents moved to Lincolnshire, which was about a half mile, as said before, and they were very heavily involved in my kids' early childhood and loved that they could be around to see them all the time. In 2008, a year after my dad's death, my mom started to spend more and more time in their Florida condo until she permanently moved there. All right, that's a little of the background that you heard before. All right, now let's talk about my mom. I think the one thing that everyone could agree with was that my mom, she was a lot of fun. When going out, she was usually the life of the party. She loved dancing, and her willing partner happened to be my Uncle Alex. My mom and dad were lucky in that his job took him around the world and they got to travel together to many exotic places. She loved to talk and meet other people and really would just about talk to anyone. My parents had a very close-knit group of friends that she stayed in touch with her whole life. They were friends from work, family friends, and community theater friends. Helen and Alex were extremely close to them, and they had tons of good times together. Another lifelong friend, Enid, who became our summer girl and watched over us in the early 60s, has remained friends for her whole life, and Enid is still a big part of our family today. My mom was a good person and adored her kids, nieces, and nephews. From what I was told, she loved medicine and would do all the nursing in the family when one of us was hurt when we were young, from stitching up Janet's hand to fixing my scraped knees. We often would travel to South Haven in the summers with both our families. Those were great fun and provides us lasting memories to this day. One of her passions was to make sure my brother and I were active in sports and activities from a very early age. She brought us out to the tennis courts, and this continued with my dad and all her grandkids. And as was said before, she loved coaching us all, to say the least. She also made sure we played baseball and golf, and Danny and I would go golfing with my mom regularly until she turned 90, when we would go visit her in Florida. It gave her very great pleasure to be with her boys on the course. During the time at Keystone, my mom joined the community theater and loved acting in plays and especially the after parties. She made many lifetime friends during those times, which she kept throughout her life. My mom loved to gamble, especially poker. She made sure always to get out the sock of pennies after Thanksgiving was over so everyone could play and learn from her. Later on in life, we often visited casinos to play blackjack and enjoy a nice dinner afterwards. Another passion of hers was bridge. She discovered the intricacies and complexities of it, and she was hooked, and would regularly study all the books and magazines she could get her hands on. I'm not going to get into all the great times we had with my mom, from Lion Country Safari and to the Florida vacation with my kids. There are just too many to recall. What I'm going to do is talk about my mom's best attributes. She was a very loyal and caring mom and grandmother. My mom always had my back and would go out of her way to help me when I needed it. She was also my biggest advocate in my life and helped me get through some very tough times that I had. She had a great sense of humor and just seemed to get it. Laughing and joking around came very easy for her. She was extremely intelligent and, as I said before, very fun to be around. All of Danny and my friends just loved being around my mom. She was very fun. I could go on, but I will conclude this by saying Danny and I loved her very much and will miss her greatly. I love you, Mom, and we'll never forget the good times that we had. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. Call forward now grandson Max.
Hey everyone, today I'm filled with mixed emotion. A big part of me is actually feeling happy over the last week. Spent a lot of time thinking about really nice memories with Grandma. I think back to Josh, Hannah, myself, Jenna, walking through the garage at our Lincolnshire place, getting a huge whiff of the gasoline from her red car, and then going in, and her and Grandpa would be ready with roast beef sandwiches, chocolate phosphates, and then Grandma would kind of whip us into the den, and we'd just go play poker or gin rummy, and then maybe go to the courts later, and she would teach us tennis. I was saying to Cacao earlier that up until my late teenage years, and her being in her late 70s, maybe 80s, I don't think I won a game off her, ever. Or going to Florida and her jumping in the ocean with us. I don't normally think about a grandparent swimming in the ocean, but she was always super active. And I really can recall a very strong sense of her really just loving to hang out with us, even as little kids, and being very supportive. I'm of course also feeling sad not just with her loss, but over the last 10 years, having not been so close with her. And after Grandpa passed and she kind of moved to Florida more full time, lost a sense of closeness and connection that I think left a lot of us missing her. I was missing her. And just makes me think about how we all deal with grief and life challenges differently. And so I miss her, and I'll continue missing her. Love you, Grandma. Yeah.
Thank you, Max. Ruth's niece, Laura Beth.
Hi, I'm Ruth's niece, and only this side of the family calls me Laura Beth. I'm the only child of her brother Ray, who is 2 years older than her, and her only sibling with whom she was very close. I brought this photo today. I can show it around if you can't see it all. It sits in my living room. This is my aunt and my dad with their parents, our grandparents, Morris and Vu, and Bubby in the middle. When I pass this photo, I see not only their warm eyes and smiles and extremely fashionable clothes, I might add, which I'm kind of jealous of. I see a sense of family pride and loyalty. As we know, my aunt was far from a wallflower. Her personality was bigger than life itself. It was this character, combined with her fierce loyalty, that made her into what we would call today a protective mama bear. My grandpa, who my aunt also adored, was a house painter for a living. It's going to be a repeat. I got to choose a bedroom color every time he stayed to repaint our house. On my dad's birth certificate, he listed his profession as interior decorator. I discovered that when I was in interior design school myself, and it made me proud. My aunt and Uncle Leon brought Grandpa to live with them during his final years. When he became ill and was in the hospital, one night I decided to go see him on my own because even though he was about to be released, I waited a long time in the waiting room, and Uncle came out and asked who told me to come here. And I said, no one. I just felt like I should visit. He told me Grandpa had taken a turn for the worse and brought me to his room. My aunt was by his side while he laid still, singing softly to him. She continued to sing for the next half an hour until he passed away. My dad and my aunt grew up in a flat with their Uncle Jack, Bubby, and other extended family in Humboldt Park, as you heard. They remained close into adulthood, even when my aunt lived in another state and my dad was in the military training German Shepherds in Europe during the Korean War. Aunt took care of me as a newborn while my mom was still in the hospital because of childhood complications. My fondest memory as a child is her driving the station wagon with us kids sliding around on the bench seats in the back prior to seatbelts. Also, when I'm in line in a grocery store and chatting up who's ever in line, or the poor cashier who is trapped and can't get out, I'm thinking of my aunt. because I do the same thing she does. My dad and aunt enjoy golfing together and other interests. One night when I was about 12 years old, my dad came home from being at aunt and uncle's and woke me up and sat on my bed and said, "One day you're going to want to try marijuana, and it's okay if you tell me." And I'm like, can I go back to sleep now? During his last decade, my dad struggled with clinical depression and spent a lot of time in one room at home. One of the exceptions, though, was that he would talk a lot on the phone with my aunt. During his final 3 years, he went to live with aunt and uncle. Aunt told me, "I'm going to make him help around the house and get more active." And I said, "I believe you." My dad's spirits did improve quite a bit while living with them, and it's nice to think she extended his life with her support and both of them being under the same roof again. More recently, I got curious about how my grandparents, who grew up near the city of Kiev, arrived to the U.S. I located the Ellis Island manifest of passengers from the ship my grandpa arrived on from Budapest on October 1st, 1923, which was exactly 7 years before my dad was born. My grandpa was alone and 21 years old, so I was glad to see that address where he was going to stay was also listed in Cleveland, Ohio, with his cousin Joe France. My last longer conversation with Aunt Ruth was a couple years ago on her birthday. I was in Cleveland at the time, and I had just gotten back from a Lyft driver taking me to see the home on Hillock Avenue where Grandpa lived. I texted the photos of the house to Aunt's caregiver, Mary, to show them to my aunt. When I told Aunt what the photos were of, she got excited and said, "I love my daddy." Aunt Ruth, I picture you surrounded by warmth, peace, and family like you were that day. And I love you. We love you.
Thank you, Laura Beth and Max and Paul. Beautiful remarks. Leida hi reshit uftirat tachlit hachayim kamasahem kahalicha tzmicha mishalav l'shalav. Birth is a beginning, death is a destination. Life is a journey, a going, a growing from stage to stage. Now the life journey of Ruth Weiss has now come to its conclusion, its destination. And so, O God, into your care we entrust the spirit of Ruth Weiss. For you keep faith with your children in death as in life. Sustain us, O God, that we may meet with serenity the mysteries that lie ahead for us, knowing that when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you, O God, will be with us as a loving friend in whom we put our trust. You are the light of our lives and our hope in eternity. Please now rise for the memorial prayer, the El Malei Rachamim. Mourner's Kaddish will be recited not here, but at the cemetery. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, Im Kedoshim U'Tehorim, Kezohar Harakim Asirim, Et Nishmat Ruth Bat Moshe, Shehalcha Le'olama. Baal Harachamim Yasireha, Beset Kenafav Le'olamim, B'Ritzvor B'Tzor HaChaim Et Nishmata. Adonai Hu Nechalata Tanuach B'Shalom, Al Mishkava, V'Nomar. Amen. Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence with the holy and the pure who shine like the light of the heavens. To Ruth Weiss, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let her find refuge in your eternal presence and within the shadow of your wings. Let her soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is her inheritance. May she rest in peace, and we say, Amen. You may be seated.
The interment will take place at Shalom Memorial Park in Arlington Heights, just a short ride from the chapel here. If you're going to the cemetery, we'll make sure that we have a funeral sticker on the front windshield of your car, as well as a magnetic flag for your vehicle. The Shiva will be at Max and Benny's Restaurant in Northbrook at 461 Waukegan Road. Following the interment, approximately 3 o'clock, they'll be there until 7 p.m. this evening at Max and Benny's. And the family has asked for memorial contributions to NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness, and all that information is listed in the service folder. And for those of you viewing online, that information is also on our website. At this time, I'll ask everyone to please rise. The pallbearers, please step forward as we escort Ruth's casket from the chapel. You're going to the cemetery, we'll ask that you go to your